Technology and Development Studies. This is here in New Delhi. He was born a bit more than 60 years ago in a village of, which is today Pakistan, but then he moves to India. He is Hindu. His origin is Hindu. And he has been working, yesterday we were talking that we have a sort of, we're working in a sort of schizophrenia, because in some way he has been working like an astrophysicist, doing stellar galaxy dynamics. He was here actually 20 years ago already in a conference organized by Ismail on the topic. But he has also been working for many years in cultural astronomy and history of astronomy. He's right now the vice-president of Commission 41 of IIU, the Commission of History of Astronomy. This is the reason why he's here, because I am now the secretary of that commission, and we had to interact together in some aspects, so he took the opportunity to come and visit us. And in history of astronomy, he has had two main interests. One, the history of astronomy as a whole, and then a second main interest, which is on the impact of Western science in non-Western societies. So let's say the anthropological point of view of the evolution of science in what we used to call the third world. I prefer to call it the non-Western societies. Okay? So Professor Kochhar, you have the word whenever you want.
Thank you very much. It's a matter of great pleasure and honor for me to be here. And as Johan said, it is my second visit here. The first visit was in connection with an international workshop on galaxy dynamics. And you will all agree that studying stars and galaxies is much easier than studying human beings, because we are studying ourselves. And you can't treat human beings as particles. Although if you look at the history of mankind, rather the recent history, that has been done. But I am today going to focus on an interesting interplay between scriptures, science and mythology. And science here is represented by astronomy. Astronomy represents the sum total of human effort to comprehend their cosmic environment. Cosmic environment has been an important ingredient in the development of religion, mythology, ritual, folklore, etc. Hence the overlap. Human beings are born astronomers. Ever since they learned to walk upright, they have looked at the sky and wondered. The sky has remained the same, but not its meaning. We can distinguish between three phases in the history of humankind's relationship. To begin with, sky was seen as home to capricious divinities who were to be feared and propitiated. So this is the propitiatory phase, where you are scared of the divinities and you try to humor them, please them. As time progressed, human beings felt more secure and became intellectually more alert. So earlier awe made way for curiosity. Skies were now scanned for discovering patterns in the behavior of the divinities. The knowledge so gained was put to practical use and employed to establish a negotiatory relationship with the celestial bodies. So as human knowledge about the skies increased, the distance between human beings and divinities decreased, and instead of being afraid of them, or instead of being entirely afraid of them, at least in some phases, you could negotiate with the divinities. The third phase is well known, that's why ISE is here. This began 4 centuries ago with Galileo's telescope. Sky was inhabited by objects and not divinities. The cosmic environment was now subjected to scientific scrutiny with a view to discovering and testing laws of nature. Earlier astronomy had measured angles, now it could talk of distances. The sky had acquired depth now. But my concern is not with the third phase. My concern today is to discuss the interplay between astronomy and culture in general, in the Indian context. Much of the discussion belongs to the negotiatory phase described above. Although negotiatory phase cannot be separated from the propitiatory phase because both coexisted, I have advisedly used culture in the plural in the title. This is not so much to describe the scope of this review as to draw attention to its limitations. For a number of reasons discussed in a different context elsewhere, most of the word attention on India's past has focused on Sanskrit texts and the associated culture. We have no clues whatever to the astronomical knowledge prevalent during the various phases of the vast Harappan archaeological tradition, the roots of which go back to the very beginning of agriculture and animal husbandry, that is in about 7000 BC in what is now Balochistan. Also, the astronomical knowledge residing in the fields rather than in the archives, and especially belonging to communities which are officially termed scheduled tribes, needs to be examined in depth. New scholarship must go beyond the Sanskrit India. So much of what I say deals with Sanskrit India. Although I wish to point out there's a whole lot of ancient India, Indian culture, Indian astronomy, which is outside the Sanskrit India, which unfortunately has not been well studied, or some aspects have not been studied at all. Now, it's very important to discuss the source of our information. A discussion that involves ancient India must take note of the nature and limitations of the source material available. Scripts like Kharoshthi, Brahmi were introduced into India about 3rd century BC, or a little bit earlier, and they were used for writing Prakrit languages which are derived from Sanskrit. Script for Sanskrit itself, the language of Hindu scriptures, was adopted much, much later. Writing material came from plants or trees and had a short life. Paper was not introduced into India till about 8th century AD. The Vedic texts were in any case forbidden to be written. In the following I use Sanskrit words have been written by omitting diacritical marks because they are very difficult to put on. Ancient Indian intellectual tradition was oral. Texts were in the custody of specialist caste groups who memorized them and transmitted them to the next generation by word of mouth. The extant texts would have been supplemented with explanatory notes to serve an immediate purpose. What was not considered worth preserving at any point in time was lost forever. Also, it is not possible to assign firm dates to any early event or development. This is a very important constraint. It is therefore not possible to construct a connected account about any aspect of early India. Western scholarship, especially during the colonial period, tended to deny antiquity or originality to ancient India. And as a backlash, many researchers have now tended to unduly stretch the chronology backwards. We must cull relevant information from a variety of literary sources. The Vedic texts, Puranas and the epics Ramayana and Mahabharata, Buddhist and Jain sources, including those from outside India, especially China and Sri Lanka, and astronomy texts proper. The most important of these is the Vedic corpus, comprising priestly books composed by a large number of authors over a long period of time, which could be as much as 2000 years. So the Vedic corpus was open for almost 2000 years. Say from 1700 BC to 0 CE and later. The importance of the Vedic texts lies in the fact that scrupulous care was taken to preserve them in their original form. They are thus truly representative of the time of their composition, even if that time is largely indeterminate. The pride of place in the Vedic corpus goes to the oldest and the standalone text, Rigveda, containing about 10,000 stanzas. I have quoted myself because you will find different dates quoted for it. But according to me, it was composed over a period extending from 1700 BC to 900 BC. Some people would probably push it back to 6000 BC, which I think is not possible. Although its earliest portions probably contain memories of still older time. Some other texts, though close later, may contain some older matter also. The Vedic texts constitute the heritage of Hinduism. They are not Hindu texts, in fact. They are the heritage of Hinduism. If a Vedic author were to visit Hinduism today, I don't think he'll recognize most of the practices. The pride of place in the okay, sorry. What happened? No, I think I'm going backwards. The youngest texts in the Vedic corpus, like Manusmriti, could be as recent as 0 CE plus minus. They represent transition to Hinduism proper. So Hinduism as we know today came into existence about 100 BC, 100 AD, like that. The texts associated with Hinduism as practiced are the Puranas and the two epics, Ramayana and Mahabharata. They were narrated to the public and at large and used to be recast. This is an important point. They were recast to suit the prevailing requirements of the narrators as well as the listeners. Significantly, additions were made but no deletions. So we have Vedic corpus where neither addition is made nor deletion is made. Then you have the Hindu text proper where deletions were not made but additions were made and texts were recast. And finally you have the scientific corpus dealing with astronomy as also with healthcare, that is Yajurveda, which underwent deletion as well as addition. There are a few stray astronomical references in the Rigveda, but for our purposes the more useful is the Yajurveda, which is a manual for actual performance of ritual. Now this is an important point. Since the ritual was a very important part of ancient times, and the purpose of ritual is to enlist divine support for human endeavors. And ritual to be effective must be well timed, and therefore timing was important, and the only source for timing, the only clock available was the astronomical timing. Therefore astronomical timekeeping becomes a part of ancient scriptures. And there was a way of doing it in the Vedic times. A moon's position every night was marked with respect to bright star or star groups that was seen near it. These 28 or 27 stars, known as nakshatra, were enumerated beginning with Pleiades, which then described the spring equinox. Later lists, prepared about 500 AD, would begin with Beta Ariatis in honor of the then current spring equinox. So you have 27 or 28 star groups. The first one is the one which is near the spring equinox. There is a solitary Vedic text called Vedang Jyotish, which is devoted exclusively to astronomy. It is the least understood of the whole Vedic corpus, partly because it was overtaken by developments. The oldest portions could be as old as 1400 BC. And since it was part of the Vedic corpus, it was preserved without being understood. Interestingly, Vedang Jyotish deals only with the movements of the sun and the moon. Zodiacal signs and weekdays are conspicuous by their absence. This is an important point. They would be introduced into India about 100 BC as part of interaction with the post-Alexandrian, post-Mauryan, Greco-Babylonian world. A Greek astrotext was translated into Sanskrit in 149 AD by Yavaneshwara. and it was versified in 269 AD. This is an important date because first it's translated into Sanskrit and then it is made into Sanskrit poetry. So its versification represents assimilation of Greco-Babylonian elements into Indian tradition. However, Vedic astronomical tradition remained extant even after the introduction of Yavana texts. A Buddhist Sanskrit text with a long name is dated about 4th century AD, still adheres to Vedic astronomy. So Vedic astronomy is defined by total absence of reference to zodiacal signs and weekdays. Now, a pioneering name in the systematization of the post-Vedic, post-Yavan Jataka astronomy was Aryabhata, who wrote his book in 499 CE. This is a very important date in Indian astronomy, let's say 500 AD, when Aryabhatium appeared. We may call this astronomy a Siddhantic astronomy because these texts were called Siddhantas. My preference is for using the term Siddhantic astronomy, but if you read most histories of astronomy, histories of science, especially written during the 19th century, you will come across terms like Hindu astronomy, Arab astronomy, which I think are quite misleading and wrong. In fact, in 500 AD, these people wouldn't have called themselves the Hindus. They didn't know they were Hindus. So anyway, and similarly, when you use the term Arab astronomy, most of the astronomers in the so-called Arab school are ethnically not Arabs. So these terms are misleading and mischievous also. From 6th century AD till Kepler's time, Indian astronomers were probably the only ones who could calculate eclipses with any degree of accuracy. The unbroken tradition was alive till as recently as 19th century. A Tamil astronomer computed for John Warren the lunar eclipse of June 1, 1825 with quite a good accuracy of, the error was only 4 minutes. Indian astronomers did not know of precession of equinoxes. Accordingly, the match between the observed sky and the computed orbits would disappear in a few centuries. Occasionally, a brilliant astronomer appeared on the scene and reworked the mathematics. Remarkably, although the physical goal was the same, different astronomers ended up setting up and solving different equations. Mathematics was a tool for planetary calculations. There are very few full-time mathematicians in the Indian tradition. After this brief review of literature, we shall now discuss the interplay between various cultural streams. The eternity around us has stood in sharp contrast to the short time span of the human beings themselves. This chasm has been sought to be bridged by denying death finality. The burial cultures have postulated the physical rising of the dead, while the cremation cultures have distinguished between the body and the soul and spoken of the indestructibility of the soul. There is a beautiful concept linking the divine with the human that goes back to the joint Indo-Iranian times. It's called Rita in Rigveda and Artha in the Avesta or Asa. It refers to the cosmic order, not in the sense of impersonal laws of nature as ascertained from the outside, that is what modern science does, but as an example of righteous cosmic conduct which the humans should emulate. So this Artha, for example, applies to the cosmic objects, but it also enjoins upon human beings to have a similar code for themselves, which modern science doesn't. The sun, moon and other geocentric planets dutifully and predictably orbit around the sun. Their predictability was a source of comfort, in contrast to the sudden ill-omened appearance of comets, meteors, eclipses, when they were not understood, earthquakes, etc. The laws regulating the behavior of these divinities are inbuilt into the system. But similar regulation of human conduct can come only from an explicit prescription of a code of ethical conduct. Emphasis on Artha is far more pronounced in the Avestha than Rigveda. Rigveda is more immoral than Avestha that way. The sun... Now this is the next point. To bring the terrestrial and the celestial closer together, the Vedic people assigned the attributes of one to the other. So there is an interchange of attributes. Planets return to their place in the sky, so do seasons on the earth. But human beings are born and die. So in analogy with the planets, human beings should also have continuity. To achieve this, the concept of reincarnation was introduced. But in a certain sense, planets are condemned to a life of incessant motion. An endless cycle of birth and death would be a punishment rather than a boon. Therefore, the concept of what we may call truncated eternity was introduced under the name Moksha or Nirvana. In Hindu texts call it Moksha, Buddhist texts call it Nirvana, but it's the same thing. Nirvana is a more popular term, whereby a soul is liberated from the constraints of future birth. So that sets a goal for human beings. You should not go on and on like planets. You should have a goal, and that goal is attaining Nirvana. Now, this is an example where you have taken an attribute of the planets, modified it and applied it to the human beings. The other way is more interesting. Far more important were the human attributes assigned to the gods. The concept of age, birth and death was introduced for the cosmos as a whole, and a cosmic chronology in the form of the Yuga system was constructed by suitably scaling up the human calendar. So you have human calendar and you construct a calendar for the divinities. The eternity of the planetary orbits was generalized to set up an oscillating universe without beginning or end. For the mathematically oriented brave hearts, I have given the technical details, but they need not concern us here. I may give some important features of the scheme. In the Vedic period, a year was taken to comprise 12 months and 360 days. Multiply these two numbers to get 4,320. Now suffix this number with the requisite number of zeros to produce long structured time spans. Anyone who is interested, I can tell him later. So the basic unit is a Mahayuga. In fact, Maha is the etymologically also the same word as mega. So Yuga is an age. Mahayuga is a mega age which is made up of 4.32 million years. And then you define a Brahma's day by multiplying it by 1000 so that you get 4.32 billion years. Ancient Indians were probably the only people talking of such large numbers and of the endlessness of the universe. These numbers have been noticed by modern cosmologists in their textbooks as the cosmological timescales indeed turn out to be the order of the billions of years. A Mahayuga in turn is composed of 4 ages. These are the names Satya or Krita, Treta, Dwapar and Kali. And the scheme has some very interesting attributes. Virtue decreases down the ages in the ratio 4:3:1. Duration of the individual ages also decreases, so which is a good thing. The good times are longer than bad times. Kali Yuga is the shortest, and we are presently in Kali Yuga. This scheme must have been found very attractive, although it's a very artificial scheme, because it was used in entirely different contexts with the same terminology. These long ages were employed in astronomy. The terminology of the 4 yugas was also employed by the Puranas to periodize political history, going back only 100 generations. So this multi-use has caused tremendous confusion, because time scales are different, terminology is the same. The scheme was formulated in the Kali Yuga itself. It is significant that the present age was postulated to be the Kali Yuga. We are now in the worst of times. Things can only improve. Imagine if we had been placed in any of the earlier yugas, things would have had to become worse before they could improve. It is thus an inherently optimistic scheme. During the movement against the British rule in India, the dark Kali Yuga's making way for Satya Yuga was repeatedly invoked to enhance nationalist consciousness. Now I come to the point that how sacred texts have influenced science, science meaning astronomy. Use of early astronomical data in the ritual profoundly influenced the later course of astronomical developments. The Yuga system, which is part of the Vedic corpus, was, with its nomenclature, was borrowed by the astronomers. Thus the Surya Siddhant, instead of saying that the Saturn's period is 29.4 years, you would say that Saturn makes so many revolutions in a Mahayuga. It would have been more convenient to say in a million years or a billion years, but this 4.32 was used out of loyalty to the Vedic things. Interestingly, Aryabhata set his kalpa equal to 1000 Mahayugas instead of the Vedic 1000. I mentioned the Brahma's day, which is also known as kalpa, was 1000 times. He made it 1008. Why did he do that? Because 1008 is divisible by 7. So all kalpas, each 4.32 billion years apart, will begin on the same day of the week. This is, I think, example of foresight. He deviated from the Vedic Yuga scheme in another way also. He split a Mahayuga into 4 equal parts. Why I mention it is that later astronomers have criticized Aryabhata for deviating from the Vedic corpus. So the astronomical texts were seen as revealed texts. Astronomy was not seen as deduced knowledge. It's true in healthcare, for example. But as revealed knowledge, and then astronomers were criticized for deviating from the Vedic corpus. Like the Vedic anthologies, astronomical texts were composed in verse, so that an astronomer had to be a Sanskrit poet first. Constraints of meter force astronomers to use synonyms and take recourse to allusions. This introduced ambiguity at places. More importantly, only conclusions were preserved and not the arguments leading to them. Generally speaking, there was a tendency to present astronomical results as revealed knowledge rather than deduced. Interestingly, although India invented the decimal numerical system, astronomical texts, bound by the self-imposed constraint of metrical poetry, present numbers as words, at times leading to misreading and misinterpretation. Here is an example. Aryabhata believed in the spin of the earth and said so in his work. This, however, never became a part of the mainstream. He was severely criticized for this by his adversaries. Even later astronomers belonging to his own school felt so embarrassed that they tried to change a word here and there in his work to convey the impression that the great master, like everybody else, took the earth to be non-spinning. Interestingly, this is a Hindu text, it's called Skanda Purana. It describes the earth as revolving like a spinning top. So here we have an example of a religious text subscribing to a scientific view, even though it was not a commonplace. So you have astronomical texts which consider earth to be static, and you have a religious text which believes that the earth is spinning. It should be the other way around. Today we give great credit to Aryabhata for his belief in our spin, but it's important to keep in mind that our source of knowledge on this is his critics, who were putting Aryabhata's lapses on record. As an analogy, we may note that we know about the deeds of revolutionaries fighting for India's freedom from the charge sheets filed against them by the colonial government. So since they were condemned, they were treated as criminals. So what was criminal activity for the British Indian government became heroism for Indian nationalists. So similarly, Aryabhata was criticized. Today we give him credit for believing in the spin of the earth, but it's based on the condemnation which he got. As a belated compensation, Aryabhata's glorifiers are now falsely credit him with belief in heliocentrism. They do not realize the significance of such a belief in religious context. He like everybody else, he believed that the sun goes around the earth, but this is some sort of a backlash. If astronomy had followed a prose tradition, as was the case with the post-Vedic Upanishads, some later scholars could have revived and expanded on Aryabhata's hypothesis. So, my aim is to draw attention to the limitations of an oral tradition. Indian astronomers were not aware of the theory of precession of equinoxes. This was ignorance of the times. A creative astronomer would adjust his parameters so that his computed planetary orbits matched the observations. With the passage of time, the match would disappear, necessitating the arrival of a new mathematician astronomer. Interestingly, this is a significant point. While astronomical texts are known by the name of their authors, their elements were used to upgrade old texts which were claimed to be divine in origin. This was done to enhance the value of these works in the astrological market. So we have two types of texts. There are texts which are purely scientific texts, very precise, like Aryabhatian, which are known by the name of the author. But then their elements were taken, incorporated in other texts, like which has a name like Surya Siddhant, for example. Surya is sun. So this is sun god astronomy. So the elements have come from known texts, but they are presented as divine, so that astrological market value increases. It is noteworthy that Buddha was dead set against astrology. As long as Buddhism held sway in India, astronomy went in decline. It is only on resurgence of Hinduism that astronomy revived. By the time Buddhism was exported, especially to China, astrology had become part of it, and it went with Buddhism. So, old astronomical knowledge remains a living tradition, even if its role is not so obvious. Spring and autumn equinoxes, as well as winter solstice, but not so much the spring solstice, are still celebrated as religious festivals. I have given the names. If anyone is interested, I can skip that. Interestingly, Jupiter's 12-year orbital period is also celebrated as a Kumbh festival, which comes every 12 years. And since 12 years is a long period, there are smaller Kumbhs after every 4 months. So Jupiter's orbital period is celebrated, and Jupiter is significant because its orbital period is almost exactly 12 times the Sun's orbital period. Traditional almanacs in current use still use old prescriptions. They have accumulated an error of 23 days due to precession of equinoxes, but nobody seems to mind. There's an error of 23 days in the calendars, religious calendar which is used. The reason is that phenomena like ingress into a zodiacal sign are not visible to the eye, so it doesn't really matter. Since eclipses can be timed now with great accuracy, their computation is not done traditionally, but on the basis of modern algorithms. Much of the contemporary interest still centers on the astrological universe, as you can well imagine. Interest in the progress sense, for some reason, extends only to the black holes and the origin of the universe. I'm sure those of you who have participated in outreach program and have lectured to common people would agree with me that no matter what you speak on, the questions invariably are on black holes and cosmology, and at least I can say in the Indian context, on astrological universe. This is probably so because here the difference between the layperson and the expert gets blurred when it comes to black holes and oscillating universe. Now this was an example where astronomy followed scriptures, like versifying, treating it as revealed knowledge, borrowing concepts from Vedic texts, even though they were very artificial, Now I wish to give you an example how science has modified sacred texts. In the Vedic corpus, eclipses are attributed to a demon called Rahu. Rahu is explicitly named in Atharva Veda. Chandogya Upanishad declares, there is an analogy in an old text, that a soul which has acquired pure knowledge is liberated from the body, like the moon becoming free from Rahu. So Rahu is a demon which grabs sun or moon and causes their eclipse. Since the cause of eclipse was not known, Rahu was classified among bad omens, as in the 4th century Buddhist text. Interestingly, even within the framework of mythology, attempts were made to answer critical questions. Now, even within mythology, the question arises that eclipse is caused because the demon swallows the sun or the moon, but eclipse comes to an end. So there has to be a way out. So the way out was that the demon's head was chopped off. So you only keep the head, so that the eclipsed body had an exit route. As a term, now there is another term which is called Ketu. It goes back to Rigveda itself. However, unlike Rahu, whose name and character remained unchanged, the name Ketu has been used variously. In fact, Rahu is a proper name. So if I write in English, I should write Rahu with a capital R, but Ketu is a dictionary word which was used in various senses, at least in the Vedic corpus. Now, in 499 AD, this is Aryabhata's book, mathematical theory of eclipse was propounded, which tells you that there are two lunar nodes which cause eclipse. So earlier you had one demon causing eclipse, now you need two. So the two lunar names, the two lunar nodes were called Rahu and Ketu. Rahu was already associated with eclipse as the severed head of the demon. The headless body, which had been ignored so far, was revived, and it was given a new name, Ketu, so that now you have two demons causing eclipse, because you have two nodes. Now this is a very important point. Earlier, eclipse was a bad omen, because you didn't know when it would come. Like it was like meteors, like earthquake. But once you have the mathematical theory of eclipse, eclipse becomes predictable. So these two nodes, you can calculate. You can calculate their precession. So they are transferred to the category of planets. Because as I had said earlier, you feel comfortable with the planets because they are predictable. Even if a planet goes retrograde, you know it's a temporary thing, unlike an earthquake or a meteor. So now the eclipse was transferred from the domain of demons to the planets because they were amenable to mathematics. Rahu and Ketu were designated shadow planets. They're shadow planets because they don't exist, but they are planets because they are calculable. So, now this is another point. Rahu and Ketu are the two nodes, and nodes are 180 degrees apart. So you don't need two, you need one. Because if you fix one, the other gets fixed. But one suspects that both were included to bring the number to 9, which was considered a mystical number. But there are some references where there are 8 planets, especially in some temples you have 8 planets, not 9. But I think a stage came where you included both. You could have as well done with 8, but the number was pushed up to 9 because 9 is a mystical number. Subsequently, the concept of Rahu and Ketu traveled outside India also. Burma knew of Rahu as Yahoo, and it's only 8. This is the 8 spirits in Burmese, Yahoo is the eighth spirit. By the concept which traveled to Burma was the 8 planets and not 9, or maybe they kept only 1. Interestingly, this Rahu and Ketu traveled to China also. But in China, Rahu stood for the ascending node, but Ketu denoted the lunar apogee, an identification not known in India. So this is again an interesting point. There is a concept which travels from India to Burma and to China, and then it's modified to meet in with the local intellectual tradition or religious tradition. Now this is an important point I wish to make. It is noteworthy that no religious, spiritual or revealed text or folklore has ever contradicted what the people at the time accepted as scientific knowledge. No religious text contradicts the secular knowledge of that time. There is a basic difference between scientific tradition and the other societal traditions. Science is inherently progressive. It continually updates itself. There is no concept of frozenness associated with it. On the other hand, sacred tradition or folklore remains open for a while, during which it takes note of contemporaneous scientific developments. As I have shown that the mythology had one demon, when science developed they had 2 demons now. But a stage comes when tradition gets frozen, and then it becomes static, and at times even may see later scientific developments antagonistically. Hindu society has tended to accept modern scientific discoveries through the side door, by pretending that they were known to the ancient scriptures. It's a very, although at one level it looks like a joke, but it has a significance, because when any modern discovery is made in the West, you say its germ is already there in our scriptures. So you can accept modern scientific developments without feeling culturally threatened. The other alternative would be to see the whole Western science as contrary to your culture. So this is a good side door. Now, I don't want to go into the details of the system, but I wish to draw your attention to. See, I've done a bit of mathematical work on this, a very simple algebra. But I mentioned Brahma's day, and I also mentioned that you put it equal to 1000 times the Mahayuga. So I've done a little bit of algebra using these various durations of these yugas and arrived at this number. Please take a look at the last line. If you read it in words, a kalpa or a Brahma's day will begin, so will begin in a certain manner, and then you call this 71M as a mantra and so on. So when you describe a kalpa in words, then it would read something like this. A kalpa begins with a dawn equal to a Krita Yuga. This dawn is followed in succession by 14 mantras, at the end of which there occurs a deluge lasting a Krita Yuga, etc. Now this complex scheme has perplexed many modern day commentators. Thus Reverend Burgess, who translated Surya Siddhant for the first time in 1860, declared why the factors 14 and 71 were thus used in making up the kalpa is not obvious. My impression is that you first set it equal to 1000 and then do a bit of algebra and create a very complex scheme. So normally you go from the complex to the simple. Here you start with the simple and end up with a complex scheme. to sum up, anyway, this is, so I have already so before I close, let me sum up what I have been trying to say. There's an overlap between astronomy on the one hand and other spheres of cultural activity for a very good reason, at least because astronomy describes the sum total of human interaction, human comprehension of the cosmic environment. And there was a time when scriptures, folklore, mythology were under construction. And when they were under construction, cosmic environment was an essential part of them. So that is why there is an overlap between astronomical knowledge of the time and its incorporation into sacred lore or even folklore. And at least in the Indian context, astronomical developments were guided by the sacred part. And I should mention it in slightly more detail. There are two ancient scientific traditions. One deals with astronomy, the other deals with healthcare. And there's a very big difference, because I think there's enough evidence about that healthcare was a folk tradition which was Sanskritized later. And there's a very basic assumption in healthcare which is remarkable, because even in ancient times, even 5,000 years ago, for example, illness was seen as an aberration. It was assumed that a human being has a right to be happy and die of old age. So that if any disease came, there must be a cause for it, and it must be removable. So it's a very modern concept. But it's not there in astronomy, for example. So astronomy was seen as in continuation of religious tradition, and that is why it has certain characteristics which today we will not approve of. But healthcare, for example, had a different philosophy altogether. Of course, since healthcare itself had very limited remedies, astrology and healthcare were intertwined, and that we can discuss some other time. But thank you very much.
That surprised me is that you mentioned that never was a contradiction between the religion. Apparently, there were never a contradiction between the religious text and the culture of the. Why that? Because the texts were so ambiguous that it could be interpreted as anyway, or because they were right in their predictions. You know what I mean?
No.
No. Okay. You mentioned, if I understood you correctly, that. It was never found a contradiction between the religious texts
and the scientific knowledge of that time.
That time.
Yes.
But why that? It's because the texts were so ambiguous that simply they were, interpreted as being correct, or because they really were clever and they really made the correct predictions. You know what I mean?
No, I think no religious leader would contradict what people believe.
They didn't want to do that.
Huh?
They didn't want to contradict.
They wouldn't do that. They wouldn't get away with it. They wouldn't get away with it. Because I think that the key point which I am making here, all texts are under formation for a while, religious texts. So, and they are part of that society. They are part of the time. And they don't go against that time.
But what happened, for example, if they declare the earth is flat, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Then after a while they will realize that it was wrong. What happened in that case?
Nothing. The prophet is dead and gone. I mean, he might be wrong. But in his time, see, they won't do it deliberately. I'll give you, if you permit me a moment, some years ago, 15 or 20 years ago, there was a conference in Malaysia on calendars, Hindu, Muslim, Christian, all calendars. There was a panel, there was a Chinese, there was a Pakistani and me. And there's a young, I think today he'll be called Islamic fundamentalist. At that time he didn't use the term. I was talking of lunisolar calendar. And he stood up and he says, Allah says in Quran that moon is the timekeeper, moon is the year maker. And you are saying it's lunisolar calendar. So you can see the question was very loaded. The most qualified among the panelists was the Chinese, who unfortunately did not know any English. Pakistani did not say anything, he passed on the question to me. And I mean, there was palpable tension in the hall. And I made this point. I said, if God were to come as God, nobody would recognize him. So when God is reborn as an avatar or sends a prophet or sends his son, they have to take human form and identify with the people. So a revealed text is revealed at one level, and at another level it's a document of the time. And so I don't see any contradiction in my looking at any revealed text as a document of its time. It doesn't mean any disrespect to its revealed nature or what it means to the believers. So I think in all cultures, and mind you, most of the divinity is bestowed on the leader posthumously. He didn't know, he doesn't know. I mean, the divinity given to him, he probably didn't claim for himself. So there's no reason for him to contradict. And here I have given you an example which is a very odd example, that there is a text which is called a religious text, Skanda Purana. It refers to Earth as a spinning top. So astronomers are saying Earth is static, but this chap who is writing a religious text or whatever it is, has satisfied himself that Earth is spinning, and he says it so. So the dynamism of a so-called religious tradition should not be ignored. In other words, I still don't understand how or why a tradition is, when does a tradition gets frozen, that it is seen as inimical to later development. Does that answer your...
In many ancient cultures, astronomy and religion was together because was related with elements. So do you have any information of who were the astronomers, the professional astronomers in the ancient Hindi culture?
Who were the astronomers in?
In the ancient Hindi culture. I mean, were they priests? Were they people paid by the kings? Or?
Oh yes, that's a good point. No. I think in China, for example, calendar was a state activity. The relationship between religious leaders or astronomers or astrologers has been different in India, and I'm sure it's different in the Muslim world also. They did not, they were not hired by the state. So that is why in India, for example, there's a wide variety of even astronomical traditions. The year beginning is different, the almanac they use is different, year length they use is different, and it becomes very funny these days because different parts claim a festival on different days. I think it's true only of China. It's certainly not true of India, and as far as I can say, it's not true of the Islamic culture area also, that the learned people had any executive authority or they were hired by the administration to say it. I don't think so.
in the Hindu religion must change now, all these things of the Kali Yugas and so on, because now science is demonstrating that the universe is expanding continuously?
They are happy because they had already said so, see. Expanding not, but oscillating.
I mean, it is not oscillating, it is continuously expanding.
But scientists will realize later.
So Hindu religion must change now.
Oh, it's already changing.
It's already changing.
You accept the thing by the back door. See, this is a very significant thing. If I look at the interaction of India, or Hindu India, with the scientific developments for the last 150 years, not 200 years, but almost 2 centuries, you can see this attempt, which is a very remarkable attempt, because when Christianity came to India, not with the Portuguese but later with the British, there was real danger of large-scale conversions. So there was a reform movement within Hinduism to meet the criticism of the missionaries, of the new rulers. So the threat of conversion was over within 30 or 40 years. And then once the threat of conversion was over, there was no objection to incorporating modern ideas in law, literature, science, taking them from the West. In contrast, and that is relevant if you read newspapers these days, the Muslims kept away from English education throughout, for a very long time. Another thing that happened was, even when Muslims took to modern education, it was only the upper elite, not the large-scale thing. But if the first college for Hindus was opened in 1817, and the first English college for Muslims was opened in Aligarh almost 60 years later. So there's almost 3 generations later that so Muslims never really I'm talking only of the Indian subcontinent. Muslims never really took to English education. And I have a paper which was published some 15 years ago, based on data of 1901, of the presence of Hindus and Muslims in the classrooms, and how as you go to higher and higher class, Muslims drop out. So the Muslims really never, on a large scale, they never really took to Western education the way Hindus did. It's a very serious historical insight, which is important for understanding what's going on in the subcontinent and the area around India.
Professor Kochhar, thank you for coming. Thank you for this seminar, and it's been a pleasure to have you here.